Okay, well, good evening. I think we're ready to start. Is this on?
Yeah.
Yes.
Am I on? Okay. Good evening. Welcome to this discussion of criminal justice in Michigan and directions for change. I'm Larry Root, one of the volunteers with the Friends of Restorative Justice who organized tonight's event. We're a community group dedicated to promoting a balanced and restorative approach to crime and conflict, an approach that promotes justice and resolution for victims and the community. We're seeking to raise community awareness of restorative justice, particularly victim offender conferencing, and strengthening public safety through community building. Friends of Restorative Justice meets monthly. We have a table in the back and a sign-up sheet to be added. By the way, there was this postcard was in order to identify people who are interested in working on the issue of raise the age. And if you got one and filled one out, the plan was that we would have them collected at the end. And so if you can, afterwards, if you could bring them back to the table, that would be great.
Larry?
Yes?
It's just, they're just going to give them to the representative. Then you don't have to do anything else except fill it out. So.
Okay, but who do they give them to?
Us. But I mean, you said it was interested in helping, but it just means you support it.
Oh, okay.
We're not volunteering for anything.
Right.
You're signing over, okay.
Firstborn child.
That's right. There's also information back there about the Dispute Resolution Center's October 25th fundraiser, which features a screening of Healing Justice, a film which addresses trauma and the criminal justice and juvenile justice system. We also have back there's a place where if you'd like to support restorative justice or work in restorative justice through a donation, there's the opportunity to do that also back at the table. The United States leads the world in the proportion of the population that we lock up. We have 5% of the world's population, but more than 20% of its prisoners. Once released, those with criminal records continue to face lifelong penalties. The impacts are intensified because they fall so disproportionately on people of color. Why is this the case and what should be done about it? It's become a national focus of debate. The incarceration rate in Michigan is about around the average for the country, but we're number 3 in terms of expenditures as a portion of our budget. The larger issue is the profound human toll of incarceration and a criminal record on individuals, families, communities, and the social fabric. Our goal this evening is to focus on key elements of Michigan's criminal justice system with an eye to directions for change. We are fortunate to have a terrific set of presenters this evening. Our main speaker is David LaGrand. Representative LaGrand is a member of Michigan's House, representing Grand Rapids. He brings to the House experience as Kent County Assistant Prosecutor, a Grand Rapids City Commissioner, and a member of the Grand Rapids School Board. In addition to his law practice focusing on family and criminal law, he's an active entrepreneur and business owner in the community. Representative LaGrand has sponsored bills on ethics in the public sector and environmental protection, as well as law enforcement, corrections, and the court's approach to mental health issues. He has been an outspoken advocate for change. Following Representative LaGrand's presentation, we're fortunate to have 4 panelists who will provide short responses. Belinda Dulin is the Executive Director of the Dispute Resolution Center of Washtenaw County. The DRC works with individuals and families, schools, businesses, and the courts to find constructive, restorative, and healing approaches to conflict. Eric Kunath joined the Sheriff's Office in 1995 as a corrections officer. He was promoted up through the ranks to his current position in 2015. As Corrections Commander, He is responsible for both the jail and the county's community corrections program, which serves as an alternative to incarceration. Mark Fancher is a staff attorney for the Racial Justice Project of Michigan's ACLU. His work addresses racially disproportionate rates of incarceration, discrimination against public school students of color, racial profiling, attacks on the democratic rights of communities of color, and abusive police practices. And our fourth panelist, Joshua Ho, is a criminal justice advocate, freelance writer, and speaker who himself is a formerly incarcerated person. He's the author of the book, Writing Your Own Best Story, Addiction Plus Living Hope, and he hosts the widely disseminated podcast, Decarceration Nation. Following the panelists' responses, we'll open up the session to questions from all of you. The panelists have made me promise to help them keep track of time, so that we make sure that we have adequate time for discussion. Without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Representative LaGrand.
Rats. I'm much happier if I move. Check, check. Nope. All right, well, I'm going to talk loud. Pardon? Yeah, if we get it on, then I can move around. I don't really like
These are
podiums.
supposed to be working.
Let's see what happens.
Hello, hello.
Maybe I have to disable the
Hello, hello,
There you
hello.
go. Beautiful. All right, right. So I'm much happier if I don't have a podium. Thank you all for coming. I will talk about this anywhere, anytime, to anybody. I will also want to, before I forget, point out that I'm not kidding. Probably my favorite colleague in the House is Yusuf Rabi, sitting over here, who is awesome. And the reason I love Yusuf is because he has actually a clear moral vision when he goes to work in the morning. And unfortunately, that's not true of all of my colleagues. So I know that I can count on Yusuf on all the stuff we're going to talk about tonight without even asking him in advance. I mean, he has really been a partner with me on this. I am completely confident he's going to continue to be a partner with me on this. And I'm just really... I was sad when his predecessor left, because he was one of my favorite colleagues, but then I get Yusuf, which is also good, and his predecessor is going to become your next senator, so that's good too. Anyway, so you got great reps over from Ann Arbor and people who actually care about justice, and that makes me happy. It's always interesting to hear my bio, because I never give anybody my bio, so everyone just pulls it off the internet and mashes stuff together. I was a defense attorney after I was a prosecutor, so that's worth pointing out. I was a prosecutor till 2000. I came to the conclusion, this is a little sloppy, but I sometimes said I finally came to the conclusion that everything we do in our criminal justice system is wrong. And I couldn't really stand it anymore. And so then I went out and started working for those and with those accused of crimes, and did that until in 2015. My other joke here is I got sick of trying to save the world retail and decided I had to do it wholesale. So if you work in the criminal justice system long enough, there are just obvious things that are just bad and just wrong and just counterproductive. And everybody knows a lot of this stuff. But if it's the state law, you can't do much about it if you're not making the state laws. So now I get to make the state laws, I hope. So that's why I'm in Lansing. This is the reason I'm in Lansing. So when I first got elected, I said my goal and I got a bonus round, so I'm going to be there for 7 years. Yusuf only gets 6. My goal is to cut the incarceration rate in Michigan in half while I'm in Lansing. Now, I know the ACLU actually announced that they want to cut the incarceration rate in the country in half too, and that's good. I actually sometimes say, look, we've multiplied the number of people we have incarcerated since the 70s by 5. I think we probably had twice as many people as we should have had locked up in 1970. So logically, we should be reducing to like 10% of our current population. But let's start by talking about half, and let's talk about how we can get there. And So that's my background. The other thing I want to tell you, because this is a restorative justice group, is that I've been working in the restorative justice space for about 20 years. Talking a lot, raising consciousness on it, doing grassroots stuff. And then at some point, you realize that it's great to do grassroots stuff, but to control money And to change stuff, it's nice to have a vote too. And so I got on city commission. And when I was on the city commission in Grand Rapids, I got a restorative justice pilot program working there in the misdemeanor courts, which had half the recidivism rate that the regular track had. And we did a controlled study group on this because I didn't want, Rush Limbaugh attacking it as invalid. So I treated it, we used the double-blind methodology because I really wanted to make sure that one of the criticisms you sometimes get of drug court is that the people who take drug court are, of course, the people who want to stop using drugs. So, of course, your data is good. So we wanted to avoid self-selection problems in our courts program there. But the numbers were really great. When I then went on to be on the Grand Rapids School Board, and I don't know how many of you folks know what goes on in public schools, but it may blow your hair back, but I'm going to steal some of your thunder. We suspend and expel black kids at about a 6-to-1 ratio to white kids across the country. It's not a Grand Rapids problem, it's not a Lansing problem, it's not an Ann Arbor problem, it's what we do. And putting aside the question of intentionality, turns out a lot of that you can explain by status crimes. So it turns out lots of black kids get suspended for having a bad attitude. They don't, it turns out statistically just as many black kids punch each other as white kids punch each other. It turns out a whole lot more black kids have bad attitudes. So in Grand Rapids, when I got on the school board, we were suspending and expelling 3,000 kids a year. Right. One of the first, and actually, when I was running for office, somebody from the ACLU, it could have been you, somebody from around this area, sent an email to my superintendent and said, I hear you're going to start using restorative justice in your schools. He's like, and I was like, well, actually, you just heard that I'm running for office and I'm probably going to win. Because I had worked on the 5 previous people who'd gotten on the board's election campaigns and told them all, we are going to have to do restorative justice in our schools. So when I got there, we did. And within the first couple of years, we cut suspensions and expulsions in half. Now, to be clear, I want to cut suspensions and expulsions to 0. School should not be the putting out place. And frankly, that's not what we should do about conflict in general, right? Putting people out, eventually they have to come back. And if you don't have a functioning society, you are asking for problems. That's what the heart, and so I'm going to take a second here and define for you, in case you don't know what restorative justice means. Briefly, it means this, as Howard Zara put it very well. Our traditional criminal justice system asks, who's guilty and how can we punish them? Restorative justice asks, who's hurt and how can we heal the hurt? Now, if you ask that question, you get a very different agenda. You start talking about, well, if you're going to heal hurt, you're talking about a community response to something, and you're talking about relationships, and you're assuming that people are going to continue to be part of your society. And of course, it also means that you actually focus on and listen to and don't infantilize victims. And if you listen to victims, and I'm going to use stats here because everybody's different, okay? And no one owns being a victim except the victim. So that being said, if you do interviews and you ask a lot of victims, you get a picture emerges, and the dominant picture you get from victims, punishment turns out to be the 5th thing victims want. It's number 5. It's the only thing the government can give us, really. It's the only tool in their tool belt. And you know the old line that if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you ask victims, the first thing they want is they want to know why. Why did this happen to me? Did I not have a good enough light on my garage? Was I, whatever. They want to know why this happened. The second thing they want is they want to tell their hurt. They want to tell how this affected them and how it created real trauma in their life. The third thing they want is a sincere apology. The 4th thing they want is restitution. I broke your glasses. I want you to pay for your glasses paid for. The 5th thing is punishment. Our current system really puts all this emphasis on number 5. And as you can see, if you think about it, those first 3 things drive right through an encounter with the offender. And this is an important thing for civilians to understand. We all watch CSI Miami or whatever and get this impression that jails and prisons are full of O.J. Simpsons or Bill Clintons. It's full of sociopaths. It's not. 10%, roughly 10% of the prison and jail population is sociopaths. If you ask them, if they talk about the crime, they didn't do it. They were somewhere else. The glove didn't fit. Ask their mom. They'll lie to their lawyer. They'll lie to the cops. They'll lie to everybody. Unfortunately, innocent people look exactly like sociopaths, and so we have some innocent people in jails and prison, and it's a non-trivial number, and it's reader error. It's not because anybody in law enforcement gets up in the morning and says, I really want to lock up some innocent people. But no system's perfect. The 80% in the middle know that they did something wrong, they're sorry about it, and they'd fix it if they could. Which means if you ask them if they're willing to have an encounter with the victim, they say, yes, I feel terrible, I want to apologize. If you ask them and the victim says, why did you do this? Well, the prosecutor doesn't know why they did it. They can come up with stories for them. They can come up with theories, but who knows why they did it? The person who did it knows why they did it, right? So they've got unique information that they can give to a victim. And who's going to apologize? On behalf of the people of the state of Michigan, I officially issue, you don't want an apology from the governor, right? You want an apology from the person who hit you in the face. You want the apology from the person who stole your car. Again, all of that stuff drives through an encounter with the offender. So that's why restorative justice is so important. It has the capacity to change the world. It has the capacity to completely change how we think about offenses. And when you think about school, I mean, once you think about it in the criminal justice system, it's so obvious that we should use it other places, right? Of course we should use it in the school system. Like if a kid acts out in school, there can be a million reasons. Maybe the kid's mother and father got divorced that week. Maybe there's a drug problem in the house. Maybe there's domestic violence going on in the home. Maybe that kid's being bullied in school. If you don't unpack that stuff and you say, you were mouthy, get out of here, you haven't solved any of those problems, and the kid comes back with exactly the same problems in 10 days. And what do you think the odds are they have a better understanding of U.S. history after 10 days of being at home? Right? So it's in curricular terms, it's insane to send kids home. And guess what? In Grand Rapids, 90% of the kids in my school district were on free and reduced school lunch, which means my district is largely defined by poverty, largely defined by single-parent households, which means June Cleaver is not waiting at home for those kids if you expel them. What that means is if you send a 9-year-old home, that's immoral, because you're sending them home to an empty house. If you send a 15-year-old boy home, that's just stupid, because I know what I would have done if you'd sent me home for 10 days when I was 15, unsupervised, right? I would have burned down my neighbor's garage. I would have done something stupid. Like, 15-year-old boys are not like the bedrock of responsible behavior in our society. They're just not. So these are not the people you want to leave unsupervised out in your community, right? Unfortunately, the cost of suspending a kid for a school district is zero. It's an externality. The cost of the society exists when the cops have to deal with them, but the cost of the school system is zero. So that's something that Yusuf and I are really going to have on our agenda. Is when I got to Lansing before he was there, one of the first things I got to do was pass a law, which is actually on the books, you can check, and it's there, and the governor signed it, and it says that all public school shooters use restorative justice as their first disciplinary option when they're dealing with discipline issues. Problem is, it costs money. You got to have therapists. You got to have in-school suspension options potentially. It costs, right? And we've got cash-strapped and massively underfunded public school systems. And so going to a school system where you've got teachers who are on food stamps and saying, hey, I got a great idea. Why don't you take that fixed budget that Yusuf and LaGrand didn't give you enough of, and why don't you spend some more of it over here instead of just kicking those kids out for free? That's a crappy position to put any institution in. So we need to actually have a funding source for the discipline systems that work that we want to see in our school system. So let's see, I had 3 restorative justice things I want to tell you I actually did, so you know what I did. Okay, that's that. Now, I also often say that restorative justice is kind of like Karl Marx's Great Leap Forward, or I'm a Christian heaven. Like, that's where we want to get, right? And that's my view of, like, you know, happiness and where we really ought to be in justice. Where we really ought to be in our justice system is figuring out how we can get along. If something happens between us, we should fix that thing so we can be friends. That, and we have a lot of conflicts in our society, and some of them we call crimes. Not all of them. All conflicts should be solved that way, ideally, right? And if we actually love and believe that every single one of our fellow citizens is precious, that should always be our goal, right? Not forget you, not go away, not die in a ditch, not reject, not permanently ostracize and stigmatize. That being said, given we have the system that we have right now, There's a whole lot of stuff that we need to do to make the system that we have now a whole lot better. And it is doable, and I'm going to tell you what my agenda is, because I just get to talk, right? This is awesome. So my elevator speech summary of this is I sometimes say my agenda roughly is before, during, and after. So my before agenda, I'll tell you about in a minute, and my biggest piece of my before agenda right now is cash bond reform. During, my biggest piece of that agenda is sentencing guideline reform. And after, the most urgent thing I think we have to do there is really work on Michigan's incredibly restrictive laws on expungement. We don't let people get clean records after they have convictions. We're the dam in Michigan. So that's my agenda roughly, and I will tell you there I have short-term agendas and long-term agendas often too. So take cash bond. Let's start there. This is a fairly upscale, affluent-looking room, and probably most of you have jobs, and most of you are sort of in my life experience, which means it's very hard for you to believe this statistic, but I want you to try. As best we can figure out right now, 54% of Americans have no idea where they would get $500 from if they had a sudden $500 problem in their life. 54% of Americans. It's hard to believe. It's hard for me to believe because, frankly, if I had a $500 problem in my life, I'd get $500 out of Yusuf, I guarantee you. If I called him up tomorrow and I said, Yusuf, I need $500, I'm not going to tell you why, and I'm never going to pay you back. He might be pissed, he might tell other people about it, but he'd give me $500, right? I live in such a massively supportive community that I probably have 1,000 people who would do that for me. So the idea that I would ever be in a situation where I wouldn't have $500 is hard for me to wrap my head around, but that's where most people in this country live right now. Now, there's another problem, which is we always did it that way problem. We've been using cash bond for a long time, hundreds of years in our justice system. We've been using it since the Middle Ages, and 49 out of 50 states use some kind of cash bond system. Let me tell you what we ought to do. The promised land is we should only ask two questions. Are you a risk to the community? Are you such a risk that we don't dare let you out in the community after we found out that you robbed a bank, hit your wife, whatever? Are you uncontrollably dangerous? Then we should keep you locked up until your trial. Or if you are a flight risk, in other words, if I have a Venezuelan passport and I'm halfway through packing my suitcase, when the police show up, they should probably keep me. So if either of those answers is yes, I should probably be lodged pre-trial. If both of those answers are no, I should be able to go home. Because right now what happens in Michigan is rich sociopaths get to go home. Because the judge sets a $1 million bond. I mean, I could make a $100,000 bond. It'd take a little work, but I could do it within a day or two. I could go, my mom would give me $100,000. She sold her house. Like, I know she actually has the money. So I could actually make a $100,000 bond. So forget about the $500 bond, right? So rich sociopaths get to go home. Now, there's some fine tuning on this because it's hard to get the data because the jails don't really have a central place they report to on this. But Macomb County, north of 70% of the people who are in the Macomb County Jail right now are there pre-charge on and most of them are there on fairly low bonds. So as far as we can tell, my best guess is about 10,000 people, as we're having this moment, are in jail on bonds that probably everybody in this room could make. Which means we're confusing liquidity and liberty. It means that those people, they hit that $500 hurdle, they can't clear it, and they stay in jail. That is absolutely immoral, it's morally indefensible, and we absolutely have to fix that. And I want you to think for a minute. Imagine you're not you. Imagine you're a single mom with a couple kids, and you're working at Burger King, and the kids are in daycare. And you get accused of jaywalking on your lunch break. If you don't pick your kids up at the end of the day, CPS picks your kids up. And it's a half-time job to get your kids back. And in Grand Rapids, I don't know, I hope you have more enlightened judges over here, but in Grand Rapids, we have 5 family court judges. Only one of those judges will let you have your kids back if you are still testing positive for weed. And you test positive for weed for 30 days after you smoke it. And in case you haven't woken up and smelled the coffee, well, you're Ann Arbor. You know what percentage of the population smokes weed, right? A lot. And they don't get up in the morning and think, I better not smoke weed for the next 30 days because maybe I'll get falsely accused of jaywalking, right? So you got to imagine, I don't know how many of you are parents, but if you came and took my kids away some afternoon and I couldn't get them back for 30 days, I would absolutely lose it. I would absolutely lose it. And imagine, I mean, now, not fortunately, let me walk that one way back. Appallingly, we've now had some national conversation about like what happens to kids at the border if you take them away from their parents, right? And like we've had some conversation, and it's in people's consciousness that like if you take kids away from their parents, it is a lifetime traumatizing event. It messes that kid up, and it has effects when they're 25. And you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So if those kids go to CPS and they're there for 30 days, bad things are happening to those children developmentally. Now, imagine that you don't show up for Burger King the next day. They don't give a damn why you didn't show up. You're a no-call, no-show, you lost your job. Now, imagine how long it's going to take you to lose your housing. So if you're in jail because you're poor, because we know you're there because you can't make a $500 bond, that cascade of failures very likely happens to you. Which means, and the jail's a rotating population. It's going to be a different population 6 weeks from now. What's the average length of stay in Washtenaw County Jail?
12 days.
Okay, so imagine, I'm not even going to take 12 days, and let's take 6 weeks, right? Tens of thousands of people this is happening to in the state of Michigan. So we have to do better than what we're doing on cash bond right now. So that's my big before agenda. The good news is I've been working on this for 18 months. I got a 9-bill package. I let Yusuf sign it. I was trying to get as many Republicans as possible. He'll back me on this. I literally held it away from him for a while so I could get as many Republicans as possible. But the good news is the Mackinac Center, which is somewhere to the right, is endorsing this package. The statewide Chamber of Commerce is supporting it. Supreme Court's supporting it. Circuit Court judges are supporting it. District Court judges are supporting it. Prosecutors are supporting it. Sheriffs are no worse than neutral, and that's technical terms, which means we're working out some details on one of the packages. And I hope to get them to a yes on it. But in other words, the stakeholders, the people who are actually dealing with people who bond out on a daily basis, are all supporting this package. So, but the sausage making is that I'm literally being held up by one committee chair who will not let this see the light of day if it goes to his committee. And the speaker says that it right now is telling me that it has to go to that guy's committee. So I've been working on this for 18 months. I'm that close. It's one guy. So if any of you in here pray to whoever you pray to, I would love some prayers on that one. So that's before. During, Michigan's average length of stay in our prisons is roughly twice what it is everywhere else in the Midwest. Average length of stay in Michigan prisons last time I checked was 52 months. In the rest of the Midwest, it's basically 30. So if we just became Ohio, we don't have to become Norway. If we just became Ohio, we could basically cut our rate of incarceration in half. So incarceration discussions in Michigan are largely driven by the sentencing guidelines. And unfortunately, all the pressure tends to be in one direction for crimes and sentencing. In other words, decisions get made which make more people fall into worse places on the sentencing guidelines over time. I was talking about this over dinner with the organizers, so let me give you a simple example. OV-19 didn't used to exist. OV-20 didn't used to exist. OV-6 used to be rational, but there's a Court of Appeals case from about 10 years ago that says, if Yusuf walked up, is it okay if I make you the violent guy? Okay, if Yusuf walked up here and punched me right now, see, either I get to be the violent guy or a friend does. It's rough when you use examples like this. If Yusuf walked up here and punched me right now, you want to guess how many victims there would be to that crime? Every single person in this room, as far as sentencing guideline scoring goes. That's dumb, right? It didn't start out that way. That's not how the guidelines were scored in 1992 when they were made. That's judicial interpretation. And judicial interpretation, I mean, you could just there's a commission studying this right now. We've just had sentencing guideline creep, and so we have to do a hard reset, as far as I'm concerned, and rewrite the sentencing guidelines to get them back more in line with other states. But in the meantime, there are specific things we can do, which I think all rational people would agree to. So for example, if two people commit a bank robbery, one of them says, I was in Omaha at the time, ask my wife. And the other one says, I've been feeling terrible about this, I did it. Those people have exactly the same sentencing guidelines. So confessing and admitting that your involvement in a crime doesn't get you any sentencing guideline credit. Another one is, let's say Yusuf and I both go catch drunk drivings, and he does 90 meetings in 90 days, and I sit home and keep drinking malt liquor. We have exactly the same sentencing guidelines. So we don't give any sentencing benefit to people who engage in treatment. Let's say I'm bipolar and I'm off my meds, and that's why I do something. If I go re-engage with community mental health, if I get back on my meds, I get no credit in the sentencing process for that. So I have about 7, 9, I keep forgetting, number of sentencing guideline things that I think would actually help us reward and incentivize good behavior, which we can do in the system. Another big thing we can do is, in the jails, we have a good time process, which means if you get sentenced to 6 days, you actually serve 5. That's good. Everybody likes that because that gives people who are in an incentive. You get it unless you punch a guard, right? So that's an incentive to not punch guards. It's an incentive to not get in fights with other inmates, right? So good behavior gets you out earlier, right? Any public policy issue, you want to have sticks maybe, but you certainly want to have carrots. We took away the carrot in the prison system about 3 decades ago. So we don't have good time in our prisons anymore. We've got to restore some form of good time. So that's going to be a longer conversation, however, because prosecutors are very reluctant to have a conversation about that. Now, I'm going to have a conversation with them about that, and I'm going to try to bring them along, and we're going to have a come to Jesus moment eventually, I hope. As you can kind of guess, I spend a lot of my time trying to persuade people on these things. So on cash bond, for example, I have 2 colleagues in the legislature who actually have real background in criminal justice. I have 147 colleagues, which means I have a lot of colleagues who ran an auto body shop before they got there, or ran a snowplow service, or ran a convenience store in the UP. So they don't know the criminal justice system. So I made a list of the 38 people in the Senate and my 109 colleagues in the House, and I kept track, and I'd walk across the lawn or be in an elevator, and I'd say, hey, Yusuf, you know anything about cash bond? And let's pretend he didn't know anything, right? He'd be like, I don't know, what's cash bond? I'd say, let me tell you about cash bond. And I'd say, let me tell you what's actually going on. And he'd say, man, that's really messed up. And I'd be like, yeah, it is messed up. Can I count on your help? And so I've had 110 conversations with those in that 147 person group about cash bond now to educate all of my colleagues. So, and I haven't had anybody say, I think that's really what we should do. We should definitely keep screening for poor people and keep them locked up. I mean, no, I'm not getting any pushback on this, but there's a huge educational hurdle, right? So during good time, that's going to take more discussion. Sentencing guideline reform, I think, is something we can do immediate short-term good action on, but the long-term goal is to really rewrite the things and have a comprehensive reboot of sentencing guidelines, because sentencing guidelines functionally determine the conversation about how long a judge actually sentences people for. They're technically advisory now, but the feds have been advisory for 15 years, and the feds functionally use them. And they've been advisory at the state level for about 3 years. It didn't really change anybody's behavior. You still get PSIs. They still calculate the sentencing guideline score, and the judge usually goes with what the scores are. So changing where you fit in those boxes is really important. So before, during, and after. I once represented a girl who went into when she was in college, she went into a cemetery and took a leak. She was charged with trespassing and urinating in public, which means that she was never able to get those things off her record, because there's some finessing for age now, but basically if you have more than one anything on your record, you can't get the second something expunged. So I have introduced legislation to say, let's put a wall between felonies and misdemeanors. And let's not say the judge can't look on the other side of that wall. He can look at your misdemeanors. But misdemeanors per se should not hard and fast disqualify a judge from considering expunging a felony. Now, judges have discretion. They don't have to expunge your felony. You have to go make a motion. You have to say please. And, of course, some felonies are not expungible, right? Murder is not expungible. But writing a bad check, if you write a bad check and you took a leak on a dumpster when you were 18, you shouldn't get the bad check off your record? Really? So we really need to, as far as I'm concerned, open up the expungement process. Now, there's an even more audacious proposal. There are more audacious proposals out there in the world, and some of you all may know about them. One audacious one that's being talked about that I love, but I doubt we've got the political muscle to get it over the finish line, is sometimes being called the clean slate idea. The idea being that we just take things off your record automatically after 10 years. You don't have to come in and say, please. You don't have to file a motion. It just comes off your record. Now, an intermediate idea would be to notify people when they're eligible, because back when I was in private practice, not only were 90% of the people who called me ineligible because the restrictions are that tight, but think about all those people who didn't call. Right? Unfortunately, one of the problems of having a criminal conviction is there's a lot of shame associated with it. So you don't want to talk about it. You don't be like, hey, can I talk to you about my criminal conviction? Or what? So there are a whole bunch of people in the community who actually voluntarily don't go vote because they know you can't vote in Florida with a felony conviction. So they don't come vote in Michigan, even though in Michigan it doesn't stop them voting. But the possibility of shame does, right? Which is the same reason why we have to block the box, right? Because if you ask people about their criminal convictions as the first damn thing you do when they apply for a job, of course they're going to slink out the door, right? They're going to self-select out of that interview process before you even get to go. I don't care how nice you are as an employer. So that's one of the reasons block the box is so important. That's another issue, and I'm not going to get into that here because it's not part of the before, during, after thing necessarily. Kind of part of the after thing, right? I am still so angry at Bill Clinton. Do you all know that that you are ineligible for Section 8 housing if anybody who's in that housing has a criminal conviction? That is so deeply messed up and sick and wrong. And unfortunately, Yusuf and I can't do anything about it because it's federal law. But it's something that you all should start talking about. Time is about up. Okay, so I'm happy to answer any questions you all have about any kind of process, and frankly, Yusuf would be glad to too, I'm sure. If you want to ask me, like, is it really that bad, or is it really that awful? But I am going to shut up and let other people, like, criticize me.
Next we have Belinda Dulin, who's deciding whether she wants to sit here with this, or stand with this, or stand at the podium.
Okay, someone said stand.
There's a chair on that side, too. Oh, yeah.
I thought there was going to be a question. No, okay.
No.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Belinda Dulin with the Dispute Resolution Center. Use this one? I'm sorry, is this better?
Use this.
I can yell, too. Okay. So first I want to thank the Friends of Restorative Justice for bringing us all together to be a part of this conversation. And there are everything that the representative said sort of touches some aspect of what the Dispute Resolution Center has been thinking about, pushing, raising conversations about in somewhere in our lives. But I want to focus on two very specific things. You can go to our website, thedisputeresolutioncenter.org, to understand all of the things that we do. But I do want to pinpoint two very specific things. One, the situation where our children in our schools here in Washtenaw County are being suspended at very high rates still. And the second thing I want to touch on, the work that we are beginning to do around juvenile justice with our stakeholders there, and make an appeal to all of you in your support. The DRC has been around for a long time. Our mission statement is to help people have constructive conversations as they problem solve. We want that experience to be healing and restorative and feel some sense of wholeness when they leave. Those who work with the DRC, most people are volunteers. They know that my mantra is not necessarily to get a settlement. It is to make sure that the community members have an experience that is more positive and constructive as they negotiate, navigate, try to understand and the other person's perspective, articulate their own concerns, their own needs and interests, and most of all, begin to feel a sense of empathy for the other persons that they're dealing with. And that's a very tall order in a society where we are very, very committed to punishing people. So that proposition with those who volunteer with us have a hard job sitting in that seat acting as a neutral third party. I don't know how many years ago now, I met Mark Fancher more than 10 years ago when the School to Prison Pipeline report was actually being printed. I'm from the city of Detroit. I'm a product of Detroit Public Schools, and being suspended from school was not a far-fetched ideal for me. I recognized that was just a part. So I was actually one of the mouthy kids that would have been suspended. I don't know how I dodged that bullet, but I'm old enough to be before the zero tolerance policies. I think that's the only reason why I did not get suspended for being back talking. That was my thing. And it still is sometimes, but strategically. But I met Mark, and we talked about this report, the School to Prison Pipeline, and it was more than just sharing a report for me. It was something that really touched me deeply as I reflected on my own school experiences and all the people who all of a sudden just weren't there, who had been suspended and never returned to school. I thought about how them not returning to school and finishing their education impacted the community that I lived in on a little small area on the east side of Detroit, not far from the Eastern Market, and what that began to look like in this economic decline. I thought about who was able to buy houses and who weren't able to buy houses. I thought about the children that they did continue to have and how, and then aging myself, how they were forced to be on state benefits because they did not have the education to earn more money. And I thought about the cycle of poverty, and that's what the report brought to my consciousness. So I felt compelled that we needed to do something at the DRC. How do we use the tools that we have around conflict resolution and dialogue to help kids problem solve? It's not a far-fetched idea. It was being done in Colorado for a very long time after the Columbine incident, so I knew it wasn't a far-fetched idea, but it was a very, very hard sell for the DRC in the community. There were some moments of time before the legislation being passed around restorative practices. We were able to work with a particular school here in the county for a 2-year period between 2012 and 2014, and hundreds of kids used the services of restorative practices to problem solve. And it wasn't just about having an adult telling them what to do. We actually asked those questions that Howard Zare has written about, to ask kids what happened, how did they feel about it, what was going on at the time, and what can they do to make it right. And it was amazing that students, hundreds of students over a 2-year period, responded to those questions and made things right. The program was going very, very well. Then the funding, it was a grant-based program. And when the funding dried up, the program came to a screeching halt. Fast forward the next school year and school years since, the climate that we were hoping to shift never got shifted because it became a question of money. So one of my appeals to the representatives in the room is please get some money in that bill because that is a huge barrier of organizations and community members in helping our students problem solve. I do have the great fortune at the center that we do teach kids not only sit in the circles and problem solve, but we actually train them to be the facilitators themselves. So they get to do it with their peers. It's the best part of my job. The youth are just so ready for this change. They're so open. Their hearts are so open to this work. And they actually become the mediators and restorative circle facilitators right in their schools. One school that has gotten the most press has been Skyline High School, the Sky Squad. The DRC has been their trainer for 4 years. One of the first cohort of those kids, a few of them are in college now, and they're still using those skills. They're coming back home for the summer. I saw a couple of them over the summer, and they continue to use those skills in their college campuses. They will continue to use those skills when they get their jobs. They will continue to use those skills when they start their own families. They will continue to use those skills as they navigate the rest of their lives. what they are saying already is that I had no idea the depth of what I was doing when I was sitting with you for a couple days, eating pizza and Jimmy John's sandwiches, learning how to facilitate a conversation. So I just want to add to my request for funding that by supporting these kinds of initiatives, it's not just reducing suspension. Already? It's not just reducing suspension, it's giving kids lifelong skills that can change our society. So I too believe that this is my glimpse into heaven and how we can have a peaceful community. I'm going to talk one more minute, okay. I do negotiate everywhere I go. The last thing I just want to put a plug in, that the Dispute Resolution Center, in partnership with the Friends of Restorative Justice, for what brought us together was restorative justice and working with our prosecutor, getting that stakeholder to the table to talk about what juvenile justice can look like. It's been a very slow moving ball, extremely slow, but this year we felt we have a breakthrough. And we're actually getting them to the table. So as we think about, as we go on, this election season, I'm gonna take the liberty to say this, since you gave me the mic. As we move into this election season and the next several election cycles in Washtenaw County, if you are truly an advocate for changing what justice looks like for our community, please pay attention to the candidates that are on the ballots. Have this kind of conversation with them. Ask them, what does justice look like for them? We have too many kids in the detention center because of marijuana. In this county, you get locked up. It's a hard proposition for me. I don't want kids smoking marijuana, but I have a hard time the day after Hash Bash, right? Kids are being swept up and put into the detention. It's just a mixed message that we give them. So we need to do something differently. I'm not saying they should be smoking weed, but I think we got to be clear on what we're going to do with our kids in terms of justice. So as we are bringing folks to the table to have this very hard conversation, I want you to be thinking about who our elected officials whom they should be, and how do they support us moving and shifting justice in Washtenaw County.
Our next panelist is Eric Kunath, commander of the jail and alternatives.
Thank you, everyone, for having us tonight. So I want to talk real briefly about, I was asked to talk real briefly about cash bonds, but I want to take a quick minute to talk a little bit about what I think is really important of everything that's going on here. All these, and it's alignment, right? I think so far we've heard a little bit about alignment, but alignment with all the different governments and all the different processes and everyone that touches all the different pieces to it. And I'll tell you exactly what I'm talking about. If anyone's going to start a new business, who would you target if you had two groups? Would you target the 90% or would you target the 10%? It's kind of a rhetorical question, right? So jails in this country for hundreds of years have basically just warehouse people, right? We lock them up, we forget about them, and then we do the same thing over and over again. So there's a philosophical approach that we do in our county that I just want to make sure that I take a minute just to touch on. So our approach is inmate behavior management. It's a proactive approach to inmate management. And it's also a philosophical belief that 95% of people that come to jail are, guess what? Situation, adult, normal. Just like you and I, right? And what does that mean? If we treat them that way, the self-fulfilling prophecy, they'll behave that way. So that's our fundamental approach. I could go on. It's about a 3-day program for our staff, but I want to make it clear that it's vitally important because our government officials, our legislatures, they can do all they can do, but if there's other parts in the system that's not working and not working properly or not working in hand with the other parts, it makes it really difficult to make some progress. And I want to give a couple quick examples. We had a gentleman when we first went to online GED. We had the first inmate graduate online GED in the country. And he graduated with honors in all the areas. We put on a graduation for him. We put him in a cap and gown. We brought him in the conference room with the sheriff. That changed his life. I would say a big part of changing his life. And fast forward 3 years, the gentleman calls me up and he says, you remember me? And I said, I do. And we talked. He bought a crack house in Ypsi and turned it into a sober living house. He then asked me a favor because we promised him, we're still here for you when you go. And he said, I have an opportunity to teach at Oakland University, but I have a felony. So we put together a letter for the young man. I touched base with the dean over the area that he was going to be teaching in. And unfortunately, they turned him down. But he came in and he met with our director, me and the director of community engagement, and he told us, he said, you know, it's okay. I've been turned down a lot in my life. I'll keep moving forward. So he continues to be a partner with us. We continue to work with him. He's going to do incredible things. So I thought it was a good story to share. I built a little bit on some of the things we also talked about. So I'm going to make my plea as well. So our community corrections, one of the areas that I oversee, is really funded by the state of Michigan, but it really targets a felony population. So we're really restricted about what we can do with the funds that we receive. Most of it has to go towards a felony population. So guess who we aren't serving to the extent we should be serving? The misdemeanor population. So what does that mean? Eventually, if we don't serve them, if we don't help them, if we don't give them the programming they need, they become part of the felony population. So I just wanted to mention that. Hopefully at some point that can change because it's an underfunded group that could really use a lot more help. So I want to speak now that I've told a couple stories. I'll talk briefly a little bit about cash bail like I was asked to do. I apologize. So our community corrections, which is seated under the sheriff's office, which is very unique in the state of Michigan. Most of them are seated under the trial court, sometimes in other areas. But it really gives us the flexibility to do a lot of things differently than a lot of other sheriff's offices can do. We use the Michigan Pretrial Risk Assessment, which was already mentioned. You know, it measures dangerousness to the community and a person's whether they're a flight risk or not. Up until recently, it also had a cash bond recommendation to it. Although in Washtenaw County we never made a specific cash bond, we did have to check the box cash bond for the magistrates. The new one, however, does not have any cash reference to it at all. So there's no longer a cash reference. The word cash has been taken completely out of the new praxis. So it's either release with supervision, which is community corrections, or do not release. And it's based on a number of factors surrounding those two areas that we talked about. Since we're running out of time, I'm going to be a little brief in some areas. So our population, about 65 to 70% of our population is released either post-arraignment or before their preliminary exam. So it's a large number of folks compared to really the state and national statistics. We have one of the lowest pretrial detention rates in the state. I would imagine probably rivals that in the country as well. We're under 40% of our population is pretrial. And to give you some context, so the jail population over the last 4 years has been steady. About just under 8,000 inmates a year come in. It's really steady. And if you look at what's been occurring, that's been flat, but our rate at community corrections has grown 30 to 35% in that same time frame. So what does that mean? It means we're doing a lot more around releases, a lot more around programming, a lot more around supervision in the community instead of locking people up. And I'll give you some additional numbers that are pretty interesting. So I said we incarcerate about 8,000 people a year in Washtenaw County. Community corrections services about 40,000 people a year. So if you think about just the disparity in those numbers, that's the kind of numbers we want to see. Those folks that don't need to be in jail, that we can supervise in the community, that they can keep their jobs, keep their families together, that's what we should be doing. Still though, let me speak a little bit more about community corrections as well. So 40,000 people on some level of pretrial supervision. Their success rate's above the national average here in Washtenaw County. It's about 80 to 85% success rate in pretrial supervision. So again, really good results. The reality is we still have people in our jail on cash bonds. And again, I know that was mentioned, but I'll just tell you as a jail commander, when I walk the jail, and I've been there for 23 years now, I talk to people on a daily basis that tell me, and I ask them, how are you doing? What are you in for? Just having conversation? They have a very low cash bail, and they tell me, I can't pay it. So we know it exists. Although all the work in our system in Washtenaw County, I believe, is probably better than anywhere else in the state, there's still room for us to do a lot more. The last piece is the Michigan Indigent Defense Act. I'm not sure if the room's familiar with that. We've made some strides with that. So now before arraignments, all indigent inmates will see counsel before their arraignment. They'll also see counsel before any court appearances or other significant changes in their cases. That is going to be huge. It's a lot of impact. It's a lot more traffic volume in the jail. But we really anticipate that the Public Defender's Office will be able to do a lot of really good work meeting with inmates before they go to see the magistrates and have their arraignments. The last piece I want to talk about, and it'll take me full circle, their operating philosophy. And it was mentioned about the good time, right? The carrot and the stick, if you will. Had an inmate, and we take good time. If you commit an act of violence in our jail, I will take your good time. Here's the key. It's 20%. So if you're doing a year, you have 60 days. 20% of that's 12. I'll take 6. I'll suspend 6 for the remainder of your stay. If you can prove that you have good behavior during that time, you get it back. My staff challenged me to take that a little bit further. We had a particular inmate that had been coming in a long time. Very assaultive, very non-compliant. They wanted to make him a trustee and let him work in the kitchen because he was behaving so well, and I was very apprehensive about it. But knowing what our operating philosophy is, I knew that I couldn't tell our staff, no, let's take the risk, let's give him a chance. He performed extremely well up in the kitchen. Before he went to the kitchen, I should have mentioned this part, he had a fight early on in his stay, and I took his good time. His good time then made him stay till after Christmas, instead of getting out before Christmas. So my staff came to me after he worked, I think 6 months or so in the kitchen and said, listen, this guy needs an opportunity, he needs a chance. No one's ever given him a chance. He's taking his good time, he won't see his kids at Christmas. And I said, you know my stance on violence. You get in a fight in the jail, I took the good time, he can keep the 6 that was suspended, we won't take additional. My staff pleaded with me, so we went up to the kitchen, we met with the inmate, told him he was getting his good time back and he was going to go home before Christmas and see his kids. So my point is saying all of this is it's not just, we're dealing with people, we're dealing with human behavior, we're dealing with coming back to systems alignment. If we aren't all pulling in the right direction, it makes it even more difficult. So I'm just happy to be able to stand up here and share some of the cash bail data with you, and then also share a little bit about how I believe that aligns with the work we're doing. So thank you for your time, folks.
Next, Mr. Fancher.
Can we switch it back to this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it on?
Hello, hello.
Or maybe we turn this one.
Here, this. Now it's on.
We have to turn it on?
Yeah.
You have to turn it on.
Yeah,
It switches back. Yeah, see, I need a podium because a lot of times people get angry with me. I got to have something to hide behind. I do want to point out one thing. The ACLU of Michigan's Smart Justice campaign, as was noted earlier, is focused, as are many, on trying to slash the prison populations in half. But in addition to that, there is also a concern about racial disproportionality. What has been determined is that even when you bring the prison populations down dramatically, you still find overrepresentation of people of color inside of these prisons. Many people scratch their heads about how to address that issue. Seems painfully obvious to me, and that is that you just cut that off at the source. The people who are the gatekeepers, the first gatekeepers in the criminal justice system are the police. They're making decisions, sometimes not consciously, sometimes it's as a result of systemic factors and established practices in police culture, but they decide which neighborhoods they're going to patrol. They know which people they're going to target, and they also know areas that they're not going to go into. You will not find them going into affluent areas with battering rams and going into mansions and trying to seize opioid supplies. You will not find them going into the basements of rich people and seizing illegal weapons that nobody should have. You will not find them going into frat houses at the University of Michigan to confiscate all kinds of illegal things and to arrest people for all kinds of illegal, immoral conduct. You won't find it because institutional factors within the society say that that's off limits. And so even if police are not making conscious racial decisions, they're being driven, directed, and forced to patrol only certain areas which are usually very poor and populated by people of color. You know, this is borne out by history. There has been no instant in the entire history of the United States when there has been a good and amiable relationship between black communities in particular and the police. During slavery, the paddy rollers and the slave catchers, who were the forerunners of police, had as their business to check people out when they were going from plantation to plantation and to summarily execute them if they were not properly credentialed. During the period after slavery, the convict lease system went into effect, where sheriffs would go out and they would arrest people en masse and then lease them out, rent them out to plantation owners who had lost their slave labor because of abolition. You find during the long period of Jim Crow segregation, police were the ones who were used to enforce segregation laws and to criminally punish people who violated them, you know, essentially when they were exercising their basic human rights, beginning in the 1950s up through and including the 1970s during the Civil Rights Movement. It was the police who went out to arrest demonstrators, sometimes children, who were protesting for their human rights, sometimes using police dogs. You find that in the 1970s, the advent of the counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, run by the highest law enforcement agency in the country, the FBI, which set about to destroy the Black Panther Party, the Black Power movement, black militant organizations on campuses, using all kinds of illegal criminal activity, sometimes and including assassination. You find in the 1980s the so-called war on drugs, where the front line in that war were the police, who swept through black communities and depopulated them of their male population and put them in prisons. In the 1990s, we began by seeing Rodney King beaten in full view of the world and not much else happening, and causing the community rise up and to burn down cities in order to bring home the point that there was injustice with respect to law enforcement. You move into the 2000s and you begin to discover the illegal racial profiling practices in New Jersey on the turnpike by the state troopers. You move in even beyond that and you find what we find today. From day to day, week to week, month to month, reports of black people being gunned down, harassed, and in some cases sitting in their homes and gunned down because they were doing nothing but trying to sleep. So there's been no good relationship, and it's something that must be done. But see, what is frequently the response by those who say that, you know, you're pointing to police conduct as a problem, is that, well, why don't you look in the black community and look at what's happening there with all of the black-on-black violence? And my quick response to that is always, the source is the same. Because many times the police racial activity is sparked by stereotypes and ingrained presumptions about the inherent criminality of black people. They will target them just because of what they've heard, you know, in the popular culture, in the media, and elsewhere. Those messages are not lost on black youth themselves. From the time that they're born, they hear that they are worthless, that they have no future, that their destiny is to become thugs and criminals, and that's all that they will ever amount to. So that by the time they reach the age of reason, they have already determined that they, as people, are worthless. And they have internalized this hatred. They hate themselves. And not only do they hate themselves passionately, they hate everybody who looks like them, who has the same life background that they have. And when it comes time to make a decision about whether they're going to take a life, they have no reservations whatsoever about taking the life of somebody that looks like them, because in their own twisted way of thinking, because of this internalized hatred, they're performing a public service. They're ridding the society of a plague. And they should not be sent away in their minds. They should be rewarded for having gotten rid of somebody who's preying on somebody else. This is very sick. And what it demands is that the basic fundamental self-esteem of black youth must be addressed. For those who are involved in things like restorative practices, you know, that component of it must be present whenever those kinds of sessions are being conducted with black youth, because their self-esteem is so low. They have no sense of who they are. They have no connection to their history, and they have no vision of what their destiny can or should be. And so they have to, at the most basic level, be restored to a point where they understand that they are valuable human beings who can make a contribution. And until we begin to deal with that, we cannot point at them and say that they are the cause of the problem. They are, in fact, victims of the worst sort. And they are the people who demand and require and are entitled to an effective remedy. Thank you very much.
this?
Yep.
Okay. Josh Ho.
I'm kind of the double dummy. First of all, I have to follow Mark. And second of all, and perhaps more important, I'm the person that David LaGrand was talking about, who's going to talk about having been formerly incarcerated, which I'm not supposed to do. If I'm smart, but I'm clearly the dummy. So we talk about restorative justice. What we're really saying is we need a different way of looking at the system, because the system we have right now does not work. It does not work. The system we have right now is based on kind of three concepts: punishing people, deterring people, and incapacitation. But what we find out is that this doesn't work at all. There are minor deterrence effects, and we find out from the largest meta-analysis that's ever been done, and I could show you a mountain of research that says that jails and prisons, even accounting for removal from society, even accounting for incapacitation, do not make us safer, which means our whole system is based on a false premise. We have to change the way we look at the system if we want things to change. So, how do we do that? I agree with a lot of what Representative LaGrand said. I definitely agree with a lot of what Mark said, so I'm going to start there. The first thing you have to do is address race. You have to address race. If the way we enforce our laws is not colorblind, and it's not, we cannot have colorblind laws. So when we do criminal justice reform, as much as it's a hot button issue, we're not going to fix anything unless that criminal justice reform legislation doesn't address racial disparity. As I said on the very first episode of my very first podcast, after having been in prison and gone through the entire system, you would have to be willfully blind to walk into a jail or prison in the United States and not see the racial disparity. So if your law doesn't have anything to do with that, it cannot fix the problem. You can reduce 50% all you want, that disparity is still going to be there, and in a lot of cases will get worse, which is, in no country that we should call civilized should that be okay. The second thing I want to talk about is ending long sentencing. I'm trying to get through a lot, so I'm going to kind of go quick. I could talk about any of these for a long time. We need to end long sentencing because it doesn't work. Okay, it has counterproductive results. We know that people age out of crime. We know that crime is a moment in time in most cases. As Mr. LaGrand said, there's very few people who are authentically sociopaths. I've literally have friends, many friends who have committed murders, who are, 10 years later, are just as shocked that they could do that in the moment as anybody else. And that's because all of us don't know what we're capable of until the moment we're put in a situation we can't handle. And that's why these long, ridiculous sentences, when we know they don't have a good effect, do nothing for anybody. They don't make us safer. They don't fix any of our problems. We need to get rid. Well, we've talked a lot about diversion, and I'm all for diversion. I think diversion's a really good idea. I think we need mental health diversion. I think we need addiction diversion. But we have to remember that our biggest mental health and addiction facilities in the United States are our prisons and jails. And while it is good that we divert so we have less people going to the prisons and jails, those people in the prisons and jails are still mentally ill and addicted. And if we don't increase the treatment in our jails and prisons, we will not make the outcomes when they come out will not be good. So we definitely need to focus on more than just diversion. And I was a big fan of the Michigan CARES Task Force, but it did not address the problem of mental health in jails and prisons, at least not to the amount that I would think would be necessary, given how many people in the system have those problems. I think we need to change our, my friend Zvi, who's here, once told me that we should look at prisons and jails like a hospital administrator. When somebody, we should start planning for them to be released the minute they walk into prisons and jails. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. We should start training people for successful outcomes the minute they walk into prisons and jails. And there's lots of ways to do that. The MDOC is actually doing some of those things. One of their programs called Vocational Village is something that does start training people when they're in prison and tries to create an on-ramp for them when they leave prison, which is what we want more and more of. The problem is that program only deals with a very small amount of prisoners. We have around 40,000 prisoners in the system, and that program addresses about 400 of them as currently. So it's a great idea, and we need to expand it more, and I think they're trying to do more stuff around that, but that's going to require an effort, and this is one of those areas where if we want better outcomes, we have to start making it so when people leave, they see a better future and they have hope, so when they come home, they see something different than what they left. And that's really, I think, critical. I think we need to change the way we have relationships in our jails and prisons. What I mean by that is I think we need to change our contracting relationships. Right now, our prisons, for instance, will buy goods and services and everything from all over the place. I think there's one study that suggests that 3,100 private companies are working with our public facilities. And I think if we really want to have better outcomes, we need to ensure that all of the people that our prisons and jails contract with, that they have business relationships with, are also involved in the business of better outcomes. And what I mean by that is that they should train people when they're in prison and jail. So if I'm working with a company, they should be involved in training people when they're in prison and jail and providing employment for people when they come out. And the prisons and jails should prefer companies that do that as opposed to the companies like, for instance, Securus or JPay that really have no business in trying to help formerly incarcerated or incarcerated people. If we want better outcomes, we need to build that into the system. I think we also need to get rid of criminal justice debt, which we've talked about a little bit in one version of that, a strange version of this bail. And finally, I think I would just like to say on the expungement question, Representative LaGrand is the last thing I'll say. Representative LaGrand said that some people are expungible and some people aren't. We know from a lot of research that after 10 years offense-free, people, regardless of what their crime is, that their risk is as low or lower than people in the general population. So from my perspective, I don't care what your crime was. If you've been 10 years offense-free and you're doing positive things in your community, you should be able to say, I do not have that record anymore, and it should be automatic. It should be clean slate. And there's no reason not to, because all that does is create barriers for people to succeed. And we should be about creating a better outcome, not just a system that rewards failure.
Okay, we're about to open it up for questions, but I wanted to give the other panelists, is there anything you'd like to respond to across the presentations?
Can I take a crack at a couple things? No?
In a time limited way.
Couple things. First of all, I'm really glad to hear what's going on in Washtenaw and the acknowledgement that we got to do more. Second of all, absolutely, you can't talk about criminal justice, honestly, without talking about race and class. And honestly, it's Mark, right? Sorry. Mark, I don't know if you noticed, but sometimes he lapses into talking about poverty as though it was a proxy for race, because depressingly, that's often fairly accurate. I don't know how many of you know the stat about the average, the statistically household wealth if you're African American compared to Caucasians. I think it's 25 times nationwide. Like the average white family is 25 times the household wealth that the average black family has. So that's one of the reasons why my policies, I'm really trying to focus on poverty as at least a crude proxy for addressing some of those race things. So there, and of course it goes a whole lot deeper than that. But what I'm saying is there's a strong correlation in this country between poverty and race, and that's even more foundationally something forget about the criminal justice system. That's foundationally something we've really got to address, right? It's not okay that you can predict how rich somebody is by the color of their skin. So the final thing I wanted to say, I hope nobody misunderstood me as saying that I didn't favor the clean slate legislation, right? I live in the world where I'm trying to get people to get things done and do things that I think are politically possible. So I could have a long conversation with you about the sex offender registry and how massively overbroad that is and how insane it is that we don't let anybody live within 1,000 feet of a school. But the political likelihood that I'm going to be able to do as much transformational work as I'd like to do there is not very great. I will tell you that I got $100,000 into the budget last year to work on a sex offender pilot program in Grand Rapids, because in Grand Rapids for 30 years we've had something called the Adolescent Sex Offender Treatment Program, and folks who come out of a two-year therapeutic process in that program have a lower base rate offense rate than the general population. In other words, they have something between a 2 and 3% recidivism rate. These are people who we've already identified as having done something. You put them through that program, they are a lower risk than the general population. So frankly, we should do that program in like every high school in America. Forget about like whether it's criminal justice related or not, right? But my point is, that's somewhere that I really think we have to have a serious societal conversation, is about sex offense, how we actually want to deal with those folks. Because you want to talk about people who we really, society, act like we never want to see again, and we want to have die in a ditch. It's anybody who we have identified as a sex offender. And we have to have a conversation about that socially.
I should have mentioned that as someone who is actually a registrant, that I agree with that, and I'd love to have that conversation.
Yeah. The other thing I want to tell you is, 500,000 Michigan residents right now do not have driver's licenses because of something unrelated to their driving record. In other words, they got caught with weed, they were behind on their child support, or what's another big one? Damn it. There's three I always use. Child support, weed, my favorite, which I lost a fight on this year. If you have 3 unpaid parking tickets. Now, guess how that screens for wealth, right? Tanisha Yancey, who's a colleague of mine out of Detroit, she and I fought really hard on that, and we renewed that piece of garbage legislation this year, and the vote was like 60-40. I think that went through like with no opposition 3 years ago. But Tanisha and I were at least able to make that a 60-40 loss. And we were able to do it because we were able to get up and fight hard on that issue and get our colleagues to listen to us. And just like the cash bond thing, so much of this is getting people the information so that they can not make these counterproductive decisions. So that was more than 30 seconds. Sorry.
I don't know if you all got a chance to see the leaflet tonight that came from Friends of Restorative Justice about the prosecutor's office and the questions there. And Representative LaGrand, I'm hoping you'll look at that, but I think we really need to be talking about how we begin to rein in the prosecutor's offices. Essentially we don't have the justice system that is presented in our books. Everything's worked out through plea deals. In this county, you will get charged with an infinite number of crimes for the smallest thing, and you will plead guilty in order to not be put away forever. And there's no regulations or rules about how those conversations are carried out. So anyway, I guess I want to ask whether you know of legislation that is happening in other states to begin to address the kinds of abuses. And by the way, the latest things we've read are that the prosecutor's office are the major driver of mass incarceration, because as arrest rates have gone down, as crime rates have gone down, incarceration rates have stayed the same or increased, because as we have more prosecutors, they simply charge people with more crimes.
Okay, big can of worms there. First of all, yes, it's shocking for civilians to be given the bad news, which is that prosecutors have the absolute discretion about whether or not to charge a crime. In other words, to use a little bit of a Trumpism maybe, I could walk out on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and the prosecutor could see me do it, and you could all see me do it, and he could decline to prosecute me. So that's a shocking amount of power to put in anybody's hand. And there are lots of, I very quickly want to get into some political responses to that. Because at the end of the day, this is an elected office, right? So how do people get elected to that position? Well, they get hired in that office and then they are perceived. Part of the problem is that we have a society of expertise. You want to have your cancer treated, you go to the cancer expert. You want to have your car fixed, you go to the car expert. And somewhere along the road, we pretended, or we bought the idea that prosecutors are experts in what victims need. Victims are experts in what victims mean. I went to law school. Nobody gave me a class on being a victim. But these folks get out of law school and they somehow land a job in the prosecutor's office, and then they get enough seniority that and their boss gives them the nod, and then they run for office. And if you're a defense lawyer and you're doing, say, court-appointed work, you may as well, decide to go to. You better have a backup plan for a career if you actually want to run a hard campaign against a prosecutor. And political campaigns for prosecutors tend to be underfunded. So those are all structural things that, frankly, are on all of us. I mean, I often, as an elected official, have people say, what are you going to do about this and that and the next thing, right? One of the brilliant things about the Me Too movement is, that's not on me, that's on all of us, right? I mean, the brilliant thing about that movement is, we all have to talk about this. This is not okay. This kind of behavior has got to stop yesterday, and we all got to start talking about it. Well, similarly, getting people elected, that's on all of us, right? I didn't get me elected. Everybody got me elected. I didn't elect the prosecutor in Kent County individually. Everybody in Kent County elected the Kent County prosecutor. So, we're really going to get into a political science discussion of what grassroots means, how you engage, how you mobilize, how you fundraise, whether you have interest groups, how effective those can be, and that's another discussion. But I really think that is an absolutely compelling political question that really ought to be addressed. I mean, one of the things that we all saw was the train wreck of how juvenile lifers were dealt with when they had to get resentenced, right? And how that went massively different in some communities than in other communities, and some prosecutors just said, screw it, I'm just going to resentence them all to life again, functionally, right? That should not be something that our society should tolerate. But how we not tolerate that is we have elections.
I want to add that about a year ago, I'm a member of Friends of Restorative Justice, Washtenaw County too, and about a year ago we had Danielle Surratt here, and her answer to that question, which is a different version of that question I asked her, was that we need to change the incentive structure so that we're not rewarding convictions, we're rewarding outcomes, which is a lot of what I was talking about before. And so what we really need to do is make it so what happens to people after they're released is what determines, if diversion works better, then prosecutors should be rewarded for having more diversion. If whatever the case is, whatever works best, we should find a way to reward that instead of convictions, because convictions are a very poor marker for success in the criminal justice system.
We'd like to pass along this basket for contributions. It could cost, as Joe was saying, the document that we put together costs money for us to reproduce. So we'd like to pass around the basket, and if you give $1 or $2 more, it would truly be appreciated. Thanks so much. And do we have another question now?
Yeah. Well, one thing. I heard that the ACLU has an initiative related to prosecutors. Is that correct, or I just don't know anything about?
Yes, sir. As part of the Smart Justice campaign, there will be a focus on prosecutors, revolving largely around the upcoming races in 2020. That plan is in development, so it is not.
Thank you. Okay, next question.
I just want to speak on behalf of the seriously mentally ill. The seriously mentally ill, because it seems to me that unless we have adequate services for the seriously mentally ill, there is an inverse relationship between the closure of the state hospitals for the seriously mentally ill and the increase of mentally ill in the prison population. So unless we pay attention to how to treat people with serious mental illness, they're going to end up in prison and in jail. And so unless we address that system in some way and bring that system into adequacy with regard to treatment of people with serious mental illness, we're going to continue to have them in jail.
Okay. Eric, can I ask you how the seriously mentally ill affect your operations in your jail?
Yeah, I think it's a great point that's probably not lost on anyone. About 54% of our inmates are on psych meds. It's a community issue. There's no secret. Everyone knows the largest mentally ill populations are in prisons and our jails. Recently, the millage that was passed here in Washtenaw County will certainly give us a lot of traction to help address that. But it's going to take a lot more than that. But you're absolutely right. One of my biggest frustrations, and I argued with a psych doctor over at U of M one time, and I'll keep it really brief story, but we had someone that was in very acute psychosis, and all we can do is isolate him, which we all know is the worst thing we can do to a person with a mental illness. But it's the only way we can manage him. He was not med compliant. So long story short, they wouldn't take him, they wouldn't admit him, and they carefully I choose my words here. A lot of times, certain hospitals hide behind the fact of their acuity level's too high. So I asked to speak to the psych doctor myself, and I just asked him, I said, if this guy wasn't incarcerated and you're dealing with him in your hospital, would you give him a bed? He said, absolutely would. So then I had a few other words that him and I shared, and he still declined to take the person. But my point being is, it is extremely difficult, no matter how hard we try on our end, if there isn't good partnerships. And again, I mentioned alignment when I first talked. There needs to be alignment through all the systems, really, to make some impact along the lines of the mentally ill.
And if I could add to that, I was actually on the CARES task force, and I wasn't such a big fan of it because I haven't seen any outcomes that impressed me all that much. But I was on the panel, and I listened to everybody. And there's, as far as the mentally ill component, there's a couple things that are really important that stick out to me. First of all, in our prisons, you know what our aftercare program is for people who we release who we know have mental illness in the prisons? Nothing. We release them, say good luck. I mean, it's insane. It's just not the way you would possibly ever want to run a system, to not connect those people. They're going somewhere, right? So figure out where they're going and connect them to community health, mental health agencies in the population they're returning to, right? But so that's one big component. The other thing is, and law enforcement's on this, but again, this is a funding issue. And can I say one of the things that I think is, one of the things that law enforcement I think is generally, a lot of law enforcement agencies are very aware of the fact that good training on crisis intervention by officers who show up to somebody who's decompensating makes a big difference in how they're treated. And a lot of police agencies are doing that. Probably Washtenaw is ahead of the curve on that one too. But not everybody's doing it. Not all law enforcement agencies are getting the training. And that makes a big difference, because it's a little bit like it's easier to kick a cat out of school than to actually deal with the problems. It's a lot easier to lock somebody up than to actually try to respond to their crisis in a more complicated way. So that's something that we need funding for, is better law enforcement training for those protocols. Again, I really am happy that the mental health courts are getting used more. One of the things that I really pushed for is we have statewide rollout on those, because those still can depend on you being lucky enough to be in County A as opposed to County B. So we absolutely need to have uniform rollout on things that we know are better ways to deal with these problems.
Are they only dealing with misdemeanors, though, or are they dealing with felonies?
Well, I actually just dropped a bill to stop disqualification of anybody who has any. Right now, there's a stupid part of the law that says if you have any prior violent crime in your history, you're ineligible for mental health court, which is just not a good idea. Let the people who are making the sensible decisions about letting those people in make their decisions, right? Don't disqualify people ex ante. So, but it's like everything else. We've got an ostracizing and a stigmatizing system in place, and we default to ostracizing, stigmatizing, and not to push back too much, but in terms of rewarding prosecutors or not rewarding prosecutors, how we reward prosecutors is we reelect them. And how we penalize them is by not re-electing them. I don't want to pay them according to how many people they have in jail, or, I mean, you're not going to have a sliding scale for how you pay a prosecutor. I'm not sure that would make much sense. But I think that's why I think that the political accountability is so important. These guys want to keep their jobs.
Yeah. So I think what I'm saying is that the way that we as the public judge and value prosecutors shouldn't be about convictions. It should be about outcomes, which is the same thing.
We got to make them pay a political price if they're doing the wrong things.
Yeah. It's just that we're both saying it has to happen through voting. The other thing I was going to say is we also need training for correctional officers in trauma-informed care and in mental health training.
Yeah, and Grand Rapids just got a grant for a 12-bed facility that road officers can take folks to and have essentially a 24-hour stay, so they're not actually incarcerated. And the focus of those 12 beds is to get those people out of whatever crisis moment they're in so they can go home, because the proper attention the first 24 hours can make a huge difference. So that's something that I'd love to see replicated statewide. The problem is, I forget who it was that said that grant money ran out. Like, unfortunately, more and more of the good things that happen in our community get startup grants, as though, you know, the magic money fairy is going to show up in year 3 after your grant money runs out, right? If things are the right things to do, the state should fund them sustainably, right? Like, that's what our taxes should be for. Or your local municipality should fund them sustainably. We should not, you know, so I get grumpy about grant funding because I hate seeing things die that are good ideas that work.
Can I make one final comment on that? So the training is absolutely the key to this. And we just spent a week down in Texas, state of Texas, a little bit ahead of us in the curve of training. The state of Texas, in conjunction with like NAMI and SAMHSA and 10 other organizations, have put together a jail mental health officer program. So we went down there and watched the rollout for the master trainers. It's something that our sheriff is committed to bringing back here, funding or no funding, grant or no grant, put all of our correctional staff through. So we'll have jail mental health officer training for everyone, not just a few selected officers that are CIT trained, because they deal with it every day, all day long, and it's vitally important. So training is absolutely it.
Joanna? I think there's someone in the back.
So, hi, I have 2 questions, and I think at least one of them is for Representative LaGrand. And I used to belong to a community where we gathered on weekends, and one of the people gathering with us on weekends was a warden in a prison in the north, like in Marquette or something like that. And the revealing thing you said, there's less crime, but the prison population does not diminish. And what she told us, she had to go to Marquette to get a job. She couldn't get a job in Ypsilanti. And she told us, look, people of Marquette or whatever the communities love their prison. You cannot take that source of income away from them. So as you were saying, it's up to us, the people. But we, the people, want our prisons. So that was my first question. My second question has to do with, and maybe it's to Mark, I'm not sure, has to do with another 500,000 of Michiganders who do not have driver's licenses just because they don't have the right documents, but they used to have driver's license 10 years ago. And there has been a bill up before the legislature to get those driver's license reinstated, and it hasn't happened. And I think, Mark, perhaps you've been working on the issue of driver's license for undocumented through the ACLU. I'm not sure. But anyway, those are my questions. Thank you. And now Ruth has a question.
We might have an answer first.
So I just, as long as we're here and we're talking about, I often, when I'm out talking to groups, say, look, complex problems are going to need complex solutions. So like global warming is not going to get solved. You can't just say, I'm going to drive a Prius. Now I don't have to think about the water level in the Pacific Ocean, right? We're all sort of hardwired to want to find the magic solution, but what's going, our growth in incarceration in America has happened over decades, and it's going to need a lot of complicated solutions. And I'm sorry, man, what's your name again?
Josh.
Josh, as Josh pointed out, like, we have to start looking at what works and support. Like, one of my jokes, I say, if you show me a credible study that says that we can drop recidivism by having returning citizens paint their toenails blue, hook me up. Like, I will support that. If there's data on it, right? Like, I don't care what we all want is a safe society, right? So we should be focused on lowering recidivism and lowering crime rate, and we should be doing whatever makes that work. Here's a huge thing that we have to work on: family visitation. It's intuitively obvious, right? Like, if I mess up, who keeps me in line? My mother. She yells at me. She's in the back there, right? My mom yells at me. So imagine if I went to jail. I would, A, my mom would want to come out and yell at me. B, who do I want to be better so that they will be proud of me for? My kids. So who should be visiting me in jail and prison? My kids and my parents. which means we should absolutely be emphasizing in face-to-face visits. We don't allow kids out to the prisons. We don't right now. That's a whole other problem. But what I want to point out is the fact that we have a big prison in Marquette is messed up. Why is that prison not in our population centers? Why aren't they in Detroit? So that people people who are coming out of Detroit aren't coming out of Detroit up to the UP. And there's another part of this that's so ironic. I just can't not tell you. You want to know in census terms how those folks count? They count as part of the population of Marquette, which means that lily white section of Michigan gets a whole bunch of non-white people in it who count as part of its population but can't vote. So we get disproportional representation of white folks because that's where we put the prisons. Is that messed up or what? Right? So the other thing is, and I don't know what's going on in Washtenaw, I hope there's no problem in Washtenaw, so I'm not picking on Washtenaw because I don't know. But in Kent County, about 5 years ago, in the name of cost saving, we stopped face-to-face visits in the Kent County Jail. The Very Institute estimates that there's a 10 to 15% reduction in recidivism if you have regular visits with your people. So why on earth would you want to stop them in the jails? Because jails are local to where people are. So that's a huge issue. And I hope you don't have a problem here, but you should, everybody should scream about making more availability for face-to-face visits.
Yeah, we did away with face-to-face visits several years ago, and I do agree that there was some unintended consequences that went along with it, and we're working towards moving back to that to the best that we can, understanding what's been done. The second piece that I'll just add to it, though, so we try to offset some of that and doing some other things. Talked a little bit about our IBM and so on. We've had two years in a row now, we've had a holiday event in our jail where inmates in our jail, if they met certain markers and behaviors and so on, they were able to invite family and children to the jail and spend a holiday event with them. We had one of our sergeants dressed up as Santa Claus. The inmates that attended were able to wrap their own gifts, present to their own children. We, myself included, our staff, served out all the holiday meals and so on. So there are things that we try to do. I mean, we can't just flip the switch and go back on what we did with, reverting completely back to face-to-face visits. That area has been unfortunately torn down where that occurred, but we are trying to take some incremental steps and kind of try to offset that to the extent we can.
In Kent County, we could flip the switch. All the facilities are still there. All I need is the political will on the county level. So keep that in mind.
Two quick things. The first one is that I think what the question was probably, the first question was relating to was what's happening in Ojibwe. Here's the thing. The people who most oppose criminal justice reform are generally communities who have created microeconomies around prisons and jails. And so when we talk about off-ramps for people coming out of prison, we also need to start having discussions about off-ramps for communities who are invested in mass incarceration. Because as long as someone who has put their whole life into being a correctional officer and suddenly doesn't have a job, they're not going to want reform to happen, and all of their friends and family are going to lobby against reform. So we need to also have part of our roadmap be for communities like Ojibwe, that there's nothing else there, or St. Louis, Michigan, or Jackson, Michigan, so that they have a vision of something else that could be different. The other thing I'll say real quickly is the reason video visitation is replacing face-to-face visits is because the company that's most responsible for it, which is Securus, strangely enough owned by the Detroit Pistons owner Tom Goris, make it as part of the contract most times. Basically what they do is they'll cut the prison or the jail in on the profits, but they have conditions a lot of times. I've seen a lot of the contracts. I'm not familiar with your particular contract, but in a lot of cases what they want to do is replace the the in-person visits with video visitation, and it's not hard to get DOCs to go along with that because it means less personnel costs and a lot of other things, plus they can make money because they get a percentage of the video visitation. And the real trick to all of these companies and what they're doing is they cut the prisons and jails in on the profits, which makes them a partner in removing the services from people.
So is this working?
Not now.
Now it's not working. I don't know. It was working a few minutes ago. But it's not working. So this is a question, I think, for the jail administrator mostly, but other people can get involved too. You talked about how in Washtenaw County there were some people who were in jail because they couldn't afford their bail. Even though the number isn't as large as in other places, it still happens. How does the bail get set? Even though the risk assessment that you were describing might not recommend a bail, the magistrate sets a bail, right? And the magistrate works from the recommendation of the prosecutor. So aren't we back to a prosecutor problem here, or where is this coming from?
So the magistrates are hired actually by the courts, and they work for the courts. But to answer your question, so the magistrates receive the same training for the pretrial risk assessments that our staff receive, the courts receive, the magistrates receive. So everyone receives the same training around the risk assessment. The risk assessment is additive value that goes in front of them with the recommendation. And I'll just be honest, a lot of times they don't follow the recommendation. A lot of times it says release. They have the discretion to put a cash bail on it if they want to. They don't have to follow it. It's actually called a guideline.
What's it called?
A guideline.
So, I'm sorry, I can't resist because I'm actually going to try to fix this problem. A couple things that I'm doing. One is, believe it or not, you'd think I was making this up. Judges aren't inherently, you can't be sure that they have any information about someone's actual finances when they set the bond. So the heart of my bill package is to require that just like everyone gets a form that they fill out if they want a lawyer to represent them, they get a form to fill out that lets the judge know how much money they have right now. So that then the judge can't say, well, I didn't know, right? So then the court rule which says you can't knowingly set a bond that the person can't make has some teeth, because you know what the judge knew when he did what he did, or she did, which is not currently the case. You follow me? Right now, judges have and magistrates have plausible deniability. So if you have that form, you eliminate plausible deniability, right? And you also eliminate a whole lot of honest mistakes, which is, a lot of what's going on. It's not that, again, judges, almost all judges who I talked about, they say, well, I don't keep people locked up because they can't make. It's just those other judges who make mistakes. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sure you don't make any mistakes. So that's part of the problem, or part of the solution. Step 2 is my bill package requires judges to articulate their reasons on the record, because right now they don't have to say why. So they don't have to say, I thought you were a flight risk, or I thought you were a risk to the community. So if a judge wants to keep me locked up after my bond package passes, he's going to have to look me in the eye and say, LaGrand, I think you are a flight risk because you have a Venezuelan passport, not because you got dark skin. I think you're a flight risk because I think black people run, right? Or, I think that you got money because you're wearing a suit. And I bet, because I get anecdotal cases where people say, well, she came in here with an iPhone. If she can afford an iPhone, she can afford a $500 bond, right? So I'm not kidding. Like those kinds of decisions get made on about that level of analysis all the time. So judges have to then say why they did what they did, which means that folks like Mark can come back afterwards and read the transcript, right? And so then we can have accountability for the judges. So better information so they don't make inadvertent mistakes, but also so they don't make bad decisions and we know why they did what they did. And that's a huge step. And that's one of the reasons that judges are actually okay with this, because it's tough to say, I want to make a decision, and even though the court rule says I'm supposed to make have these 5 criteria, it's a secret and I'm not going to tell you why. No judge actually wants to defend that position, right?
Yeah, and I think it also, we have to come back to understanding that in order to address these kinds of problems, many times it's more than just a question of policies and procedures. We have to just look at ourselves, because white privilege is reflected in the day-to-day decisions that people in power make. And so just as was referenced earlier, it's hard for many to conceive of the idea that you can't just put your hands on $500 someplace. That's the way judges think. And so you have somebody, and what do you mean you can't come up with $500? And so they'll take the extra step and they'll say, well, look, I'll tell you what, even if they're required to examine the amount of assets that they actually have, they'll say, well, somebody you know has it, and so I'm going to lock you up, or I'm going to hold you in the jury box and allow you to make a call to get somebody to come. And you're not leaving this jury box until somebody comes down here with the money, right? Or different things like that, you know? So this is a reflection of a cultural perspective, a racial perspective, and, you know, whatever it is that we do, until we start dealing with those things, then, you know, all the policies and procedures in the world aren't going to really fix these problems at the most basic level.
So this is a very uninformed question. I mentioned to one of my colleagues that I was coming to this today, and her response was, well, cash bail, the cash bail reform law they passed in California went really poorly, or there's some really bad aspects to it. So that caught me off guard. I was very ignorant of it. I don't know if anyone here has anything to share on that, but I would be very interested to hear, based on what's been done so far, what can we learn, how can we do it better?
So California Senate Bill 10, the real problem with Senate Bill 10 is, so as Mr. LaGrand was talking about there, you can do it generally as just judicial discretion, or you can add in a risk assessment tool. Risk assessment tools can be better than discretion or worse than discretion. We do know that risk assessment tools are biased because human beings create them and human beings are biased. So the question then becomes, how do you determine the risk assessment tool? In the instance of Senate Bill 10 in California, it was determined in a particularly egregious way that probably means that more people could end up being detained than were detained in the previous system. So most of the people who advocate, most of the people who are for bail reform who flipped on Senate Bill 10 did so because the construction of that tool was so questionable.
Well, and if I can get a little granular on that, and maybe Mark wants to too. Here's an obvious example.
Okay, to back up one more step, we've got to start talking a little more precisely when we say violent crime, because that covers way too much territory. Because really what we should be talking about is someone we should be saying, is this person so irretrievably dangerous that we don't want them on our community? Lots of things are going to score as violent crime, and it's a very broad brush, just like criminal sexual conduct is a very, very broad brush. But to give one example, and Mark may want to weigh in on this too, when I say flight risk, I'm talking about flight risk. A lot of judges are talking about whether or not you're going to show up or not. Well, guess what that depends on? I've been in my same house for 19 years. You send me a piece of snail mail, which is how the court communicates, it actually comes to my house, and I've been there, so I'll get it. So if I get arraigned and the judge says, where's your address, and I tell him, it's going to be the same address next year. Whereas if you've got a population that's poor and mobile, then what happens, and this is where fines and costs get so evil, is, I watched a whole bunch of defendants look like deer in the headlights in a court a while ago, where the litany went like this. You owe the court $300 from a shoplifting case in 2013, and then you missed your order to show cause hearing in 2015, which is order to show cause why you didn't pay that $300. And they're all standing there like, huh? Because by 2015, they probably didn't live in the same house, right? And the government has this sort of very personal responsibility, we're all middle class, and we're going to help you fail, not we're going to help you succeed attitude towards things like court notice. Like, for example, we all got cell phones now, right? If you actually want me to be somewhere, if you're the court, you send me a piece of paper. Anybody else in my life sends me a text. How hard would it be, right? And some courts are doing pilot programs on this. You want somebody to show up for court, send them a text the day before. Ask somebody what their phone number is, because for a lot of the population, that's actually more durable than their address. And do multiple attempts to get it. Like, you can do both and. I don't care if you send them out some snail mail, but you can do that and a text, right? You can do that and, anyway, so there are way better ways to get people to actually show up. And inadvertently missing your court date. My son inadvertently missed half of his college classes that were before 10 o'clock in the morning, right? I mean, That doesn't mean he's a bad person. But my point is, like, people don't wake up in the morning and say, boy, I really want to miss my court date because I'd really like to screw my life up, right? So if we flip and ask, how can we help people navigate their way through the system successfully, instead of saying, you're not Warden June Cleaver, ha 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 ha, right? And that's a lot of our court systems built around white middle class attitudes towards compliance and availability.
Yeah, no, I agree. And to give you one example of how that works, there was a study done, an objective study, which showed that black fathers are more involved with their children's lives and are concerned more about their children than any other racial group, which flies in the face of stereotypes. Okay, and if you talk to people in prison, you talk to people who are being detained, that is something that rips at their hearts. I mean, they want to be with their families. They want relationships with their kids. And the last thing that they will do is to place, their family relationships and family ties in jeopardy over something stupid, like, missing a court date. And because judges frequently, carry around these stereotypes about who's before them, then they presume that whoever it is a terrorist or a menace to society or somebody who's going to go out there and do psychopathic things. And so they act accordingly when they're talking about bail. And the reality is that these guys, these young women, are people who don't have the resources to get on a Learjet and go off to Bimini, to avoid prosecution. Back in the 1970s, there was a black judge in New York named Bruce Wright, okay, and he got the nickname Cut 'em Loose Bruce, and the police establishment was furious with him. I mean, they harassed this man, to the point where they just, pretty much drove him out of office. He understood all of this, and so that when, poor black defendants would come before him, he would set no bail. He would say, okay, just show up. And when asked about it, he would say, well, I know where these guys are. The police know where they are. They monitor them all the time. They know where they are. And so if they don't show up, I just say, go get them. And they know exactly where to find them. And that's the whole purpose of bail. It is not intended to be punitive. It is just to ensure that somebody shows up for their court date. And you don't have to set an amount of money in order to do that. There are other ways when you deal with the realities of these people and their lives and what it is that's necessary to get them to participate in the process.
Okay, there's two more questions and then we'll wrap it up.
So I have a question about police oversight, or oversight of police by civilians in Ann Arbor. There's some of us advocating for oversight with teeth, and some of the pushback we've gotten is saying that some of the things that community members are asking for would not be compliant with state law. So I guess this question is more to Representative LaGrand and Mr. Fancher. What are the barriers at the state level for doing oversight in our city?
I can't tell you the legal barriers, but I can give you my opinion about what it's going to take for police reform. I am absolutely convinced that those of us who are not police cannot reform the police. We just can't do it. That is something that they are going to have to do themselves. They're going to have to change their own culture. We cannot change the culture of an institution that we're not a part of. And the question is, how do we get them to the point of wanting to change that culture? Because you can send them to all the cultural, tolerance trainings that you want. You can train them in de-escalation. You can train them in all kinds of good ideas that have been discussed, over the years about what it would take in order to ensure a better relationship between the community and police. But when they get out on the street with their partners and they're talking amongst themselves about what they're going to do and how to handle situations, many times it's going to come back to, well, my dad was a cop and he used to do it this way. My granddad was too. They were able to retire at proper age, so we're going to do it that way too. I don't care what they told us at the academy. I don't care what they told us in training. initially I used to suggest that what you do is you punish bad behavior within the police. But see, that there are all kinds of practical barriers to that. Not the least of which are police unions and some old-timers who are outside of the department who want to preserve the status quo and still have a great deal of influence. Just sort of an unspoken kind of cold shoulder that the police ranks will give the chief if he tries to do those kinds of things, all kinds of things that prevent punishment. But what I do think is possible is rewarding good behavior. So that when police officers, individual police officers, are doing what they're supposed to do with respect to de-escalation, community policing, using restorative practices, when they come into conflicts, when they encounter conflicts on the street, all the things that we've talked about as good things, then they get rewarded for that. They get the choice assignments, they get promotions, they get commendations, they get pay raises, they get all of these kinds of things. And those kinds of things never seem to find their way into the careers of those police officers who are stuck with doing it the old-fashioned way. All right? And so one thing that most law enforcement officers are very concerned about, I think, are their careers and their opportunities for career advancement. And if they make the observation that the only way I'm going to get ahead in this field is for me to do it the new way as opposed to the old way, then I got to feed my family, I'm going to do it the new way, right? And so in terms of what community can do, I think it falls to us, the opportunity is available to us to talk to police leadership about doing that. Making sure they're rewarding good behavior, doing it consistently, and doing it very publicly, so that those who are in the police ranks know that that's what it takes in order for me to succeed as in the law enforcement field.
You want to correct this? I got a couple thoughts. And I'm assuming some of you feel like you're sort of been drinking out of a fire hose, and I sort of drink out of a fire hose on this too, which is to say, I have a lot of things I'd love to do something about that I'm probably not going to get time to in the next 4 years. Let me tell you one simple example. There's a good book, Rats. I'm forgetting the name, I'm managing to forget the name and the name of the author, I'm sorry. It's a great book on criminal justice reform. And one of the points that the author makes is that the closer you get policing and juries to the community where it's happening, the better the justice gets. And one of the weird things, and that the suburbanization of America, white flight, means that we typically get felony juries selected by county, which in Grand Rapids means that I used to tell my clients when I was in a really bad mood, you have the right to a trial by 12 middle-aged white dudes from Rockford. And if you think you're going to get a black juror, good luck. Because it's not actually going to happen. I mean, I actually got close enough to have two actual black people on juries during my time as a defense lawyer. Both of them got kicked on peremptories. So I literally never had a black juror. And that's the reality in Kent County, where 25% of the city is black. It's I think a lot blacker than Ann Arbor. So one of my ideas is we know where folks live, and we know how to make geographic lines. There's no logical reason why you can't say if you commit a felony inside Grand Rapids, we couldn't choose your jury pool by district court boundaries rather than by circuit court boundaries, because circuit court boundaries are the whole county, and that's true across the whole country. I mean, look at St. Louis, right? Everybody moved out to the suburbs. Well, if you're going to do a county around St. Louis, you're going to get a predominantly white jury for a whole lot of black defendants. So that's we really should actually visit that issue. But getting back to the policing thing in Grand Rapids, after a whole lot of push, we are actually seeing new entering classes of police officers that look a whole lot less white and a whole lot less male. And at the risk of giving you a joke, I saw an African-American female comedian make. Her dream was, she's like, you know what? We need to have every police car in America have a black female cop as one of the two people in the car, because she keep her partner in line and she'd keep the guy on the street in line. She'd be like, you get in the car and you step away from there. So my point is, like, we need all law enforcement and justice ought to be owned by the communities that it's in and that it affects, and that there's a lot of work we can do on that in hiring practices, but also in things like jury selection. So that's an whole can of worms.
We're at the end of our time, but before we close, this gentleman wanted to say either a statement or a question.
Well, actually, I have the hardest question of the evening, but let's see what happens. A great many of the programs and ideas that we've heard tonight call for spending more money. It seems to me that Republicans won't raise taxes because their cultural centers and their heads would explode. And Democrats can't raise taxes because they get accused at election time of raising taxes. I could go on, but we need money for schools. We need money for roads. We need money, et cetera, you all know. So, what does it take? We have 2 legislators, I believe, in the room still. What does it take to change the culture in Michigan so we pay for civilization?
Yusuf and I have an answer to that. It's called progressive income tax. Why do we have a flat income tax system in Michigan? My daughter should not pay the same percentage.
My daughter should not pay the same percentage tax on her babysitting money that I do on my salary. We have a progressive federal tax. Most other states have progressive income tax structures. We have a plan which I've been advocating for, like as long as I've been in the legislature. It's only 3 years. We could cut taxes for 95% of the population if we increase the taxes on the rich. And we generate, the plan we've got would generate an extra $700 million a year in money. The other thing is, we're spending a whole lot of money locking up people who we don't need to be locking up. There's a whole lot of money we could be saving there. So we can save some money.
Yeah, I also say it's a question of deciding what we're going to do with the money that we have. I mean, ACLU just filed a lawsuit against the Flint police because a police officer was called in to deal with a child who had ADHD, 7-year-old. He was acting out, and so the officer put him in handcuffs. Then when mom got there spitting bullets, demanding that her child be released, the officer said he couldn't get the child out because he couldn't find the key. So the child was left in there for an hour. In our discussions with the community, they have come up with what I think is a very logical thing, especially given what's gone on in Flint and the effect that the water has had on so many kids and their behavior, that rather than spend money on having police in elementary schools, why not use that money for counselors and therapists and people who are trained to do the kinds of things that are necessary to deal with kids that have some problems. So, if we've got problems with mental health and, with prisoners with mental health issues, why are we putting them in prisons? Why are we building prisons? Why don't we use that money in order to get them mental health services and mental health facilities? So it's not always a question of more money, it's a question of what we're doing with the money that we got.
Okay. Before we
To me, it's a question of long-term versus short-term budgeting. Very quick example, a program in prison, you take 15 people in it, you maybe pay a therapist $10,000 to do several of those courses. At the end of the time, all of those people get out, you've just saved $1 million. Smart on crime is cheaper than mass incarceration. And reform is cheaper than mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is very expensive. Recidivism is very expensive. So evidence-based recidivism reducing and mass incarceration reducing programs saves more money than the status quo.
Okay. I want to thank our principal speaker and our panelists for a great evening. Well, the Friends of Restorative Justice had high hopes for this evening, and you've really met our expectations, so thank you.
You exceeded them.